Long before anyone had heard the names Brando, De Niro, or Dean, there was another tough, brooding movie star who set Hollywood hearts ablaze. John Garfield grew up on the tough streets of the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn, and he approached the world with a chip on his shoulder, a young man with a grudge. He played gangsters, soldiers, and boxers, but beneath the rough exterior was an actor who believed in his fellow man and was willing to fight for them. Unfortunately for Garfield, a horrifying episode in his childhood would come back to haunt him in the most tragic way. This is the story of the tragic tough guy, John Garfield. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. One thing is for sure, Garfield never forgot his humble beginnings. He was born under the name of Jacob Garfinkel on March 4, 1913, to David and Hannah Garfinkel. Both of his parents were Jews who had immigrated from Russia in its pogroms. Life in the New World was tough for the Garfinkels. His father David worked as a part-time clothing presser and occasional cantor, or Hazan, as Jewish prayer singers are known. The Garfinkels settled on Manhattan's Lower East Side, which was at the heart of the Yiddish theater district back in those days. David's attachment to religion and the traditions of the old country had the side effect of keeping him at a distance from the realities of his new life in America. He was a cold, detached figure who, despite his hard work, found it difficult to provide for his family. On the other hand, his mother Hannah was the opposite. Warm, nurturing, and deeply loving, she formed a close bond with her son. 5 years after Garfield was born, she gave birth to another son, Max. However, the pregnancy and birth had been extremely difficult, and Hannah never recovered. In 1920, when Garfield was just 7, she passed away. With his mother gone and no one else to help, David struggled to care for his sons. He sent them to live with all kinds of different relatives in various boroughs, including Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, as he tried to manage on his own. The one thing all these relatives had in common was that they were almost as poor as the Garfinkels, and so the boys were often hungry no matter where they were living. Most of the time he was sleeping in a part of East Brooklyn known as Brownsville, which was known at the time as Little Jerusalem, due to the fact that 80% of the neighborhood's 100,000-strong population were Russian Jews. Later on, it would become the birthplace of the crime gang known as Murder Incorporated, the most notorious crime syndicate of its era, comprising mainly of Jewish and Italian gangsters. Then, after the Jewish community departed en masse in the 1950s and was replaced by the black community, it was the birthplace of another notorious tough guy, Mike Tyson. I lived in a bad neighborhood. I knew so many things a boy shouldn't know. I did so many things a boy shouldn't do, John remembered later. Though John was known for being lively and outgoing, his energy was not exactly directed towards his schoolwork. Instead, he spent most of his time out on the streets. He was hanging out with local gangs for protection in the rough neighborhoods he lived in. He quickly earned a reputation as the clown of his group, and one of his best tricks was mimicking the movie stars they all looked up to. His antics made him popular, and soon he was the leader of his own gang. He was much less popular with his school teachers, however. After being expelled from nearly every school he attended, he ended up at PS 45, a school for delinquent children. It could have been another disaster, but the teachers at PS 45 were some of the best in the business at getting the best out of troubled youngsters. It was here that John caught the attention of Angelo Patri, the school principal, who saw potential in him. Patri encouraged John to make use of his boundless energy and quick wit in the world of acting. This was a total revelation for John. He said, "To my surprise, I discovered that I could act, and I liked it even better than boxing." Finally, he had found something he could believe in. However, there was a price to pay. Good academic performance was required to participate in the school's plays. As if by magic, John's grades soon shot up. However, his prior poor school grades were not entirely his own fault. It was around this time he contracted a severe dose of scarlet fever, which kept him out of school for many months. It was undiagnosed at the time, and he only found out what the illness was later in life. By that time, it had wreaked havoc on his body and permanently damaged his heart. Principal Patry also spotted Garfield's habit of stuttering over words, so he sent him to a speech therapy class led by the charismatic Margaret O'Ryan. She gave him acting drills, taught him to commit speeches to memory, and had him perform them before classmates. Now confident and with his stutter mastered, John signed up for acting lessons at a drama school run by the Heckscher Foundation, where he soon took roles in their shows. At one performance, the Yiddish actor Jacob Ben-Ami caught him backstage and recommended he try the American Laboratory Theater. The theater employed Richard Boleslavsky to direct its experimental works, and Maria Ospenskaya taught its acting courses. Both had roots in the Moscow Art Theater, and they brought Konstantin Stanislavski's groundbreaking system to America, a technique that would evolve into what was known as the method. John was among the first to be exposed to these radical new ideas. He attended morning sessions, then lingered after hours, watching rehearsals and volunteering to help out with set building. Years later, he'd call this chapter the start of his real training in the craft, but it wasn't easy and he still had to scratch a living. I did a lot of jobs when I was a kid, paperboy, grocery boy, all those things. I guess maybe I got a point of view then, he said later. Others followed him to the lab. Stella Adler, Lee Strasberg, Franchot Tone, Cheryl Crawford, Harold Klurman. They all grew tired of the guild's polish and moved to the lab, and pretty soon it was a hotbed of new acting talent and experimentation. After a period with Eva Le Gayenne's Civic Repertory Theater, John hit the road. He hitched rides, hopped trains, picked apples, and chopped trees in the forests of the Northwest. In fact, years later, Preston Sturges would make the film Sullivan's Travels from the wild tales John recounted of his time on the road. Once he was back in New York, he stepped onto Broadway in 1932 with Lost Boy. The play folded after 2 weeks, but for an actor working his way up, it was a start and he had something many of his contemporaries still strived for: his name in the program. Meanwhile, his rough edges had not entirely come off yet. He was known to be a regular at Polly Adler's notorious New York bordello around this time. Garfield landed a much better role in his next gig, playing Henry, the eager office boy in Elmer Rice's courtroom drama, Counselor at Law, which starred Paul Mooney, who was something of a sensation around this period. The show packed houses for 3 solid months, hit the road for an East Coast tour, and then returned for a rare encore run on Broadway. It only shuttered when Mooney, who was bound by his Hollywood contract, had to head back to Warner Brothers to shoot a picture. It seems that Mooney's breeze back to Warner's brought something else on the wind with it, the buzz about the talented John Garfield. So Warner's offered a screen test to John. However, he wasn't biting. Meanwhile, John's old colleagues, Crawford, Klurman, and Strasberg, had launched a new theater venture they called The Group. The Group Theater was meant to be a launchpad for the sort of stage work they and their crew swore by: gritty, real, and sharp. They were trailblazers who laid the groundwork for what people would later call the American acting technique. That approach took its cues from Stanislavski's ideas, but didn't stop there. It stretched into something distinctly their own. The outfit brought together a mix of actors, directors, writers, and producers. Over its decade-long run, the Group Theater put out plays from a range of standout American voices, like Clifford Odets, Sidney Kingsley, and Paul Green. John was more interested in joining the group than heading to California to test for a movie. However, the group weren't as keen on him. After months of lobbying to be allowed to join and getting the cold shoulder, he took to haunting the Broadhurst Theater's inner stairwell, where the group had its makeshift office. One day, Cheryl Crawford saw him lingering there and stopped to talk to him for a while. John pitched himself as an apprentice, saying he was willing to help out in any way he could. Something about him struck her as worth a tryout, at least, so she vouched for him to the other directors who finally agreed to let him join up. Back in the Bronx days, John and Clifford Odets had in fact been good friends. When Odets' one-act Waiting for Lefty blew up out of nowhere, the group took the opportunity and greenlit a more ambitious project, the family saga Awake and Sing. Odets wouldn't hear of anyone but John for Ralph, the tender kid aching for his, quote, chance to get to first base. The curtain rose in February 1935, and Brooks Atkinson, the well-known critic, noted John for what he called a splendid sense of character development. That was it. His apprentice days were over. The group voted him in as a full member. Odette's also now riding high, told reporters that John was his find, and promised a play tailor-made for him. That turned into Golden Boy. But then Odette's betrayed the man he claimed to have discovered, and Luther Adler was cast in the starring role instead. At this moment, John's faith in the authenticity of the world of theater flickered for the first time. He had believed people were in it for the love of the craft, not for the fame and self-serving behavior the movie industry was notorious for. Hollywood's siren calls, once easy to shrug off, started sounding more tempting. If he would have to face this kind of brush-off in theater, then he may as well deal with it in a world that could make him rich beyond his wildest dreams. Before any of that, he decided to marry his childhood sweetheart, Roberta Seidman. She had grown up in the same neighborhood and was a political firebrand and a campaigner for leftist and communist causes. Their marriage was tempestuous, but it did endure for most of the rest of John's life. Garfield wasn't a saint, though. Rumors of affairs trailed him in the press, especially as his star rose. Nothing stuck publicly. Roberta either didn't care or chose to look past it, but the speculation added fuel to their already volatile relationship. They would have 3 children, Catherine, David, and Julie. Catherine's life would cut short at age 5 in 1945 from an allergic reaction, a blow that hit John and Roberta hard. The reason both Paramount and Warner Brothers had failed to tempt John before was their refusal to include a clause that let him return to New York for theater work. This time, Warner's agreed to his terms. John signed a 7-year deal. His colleagues at the group weren't thrilled at all. They believed he'd sold out, plain and simple. Elia Kazan saw it differently. He claimed that the group wasn't so much worried Garfield would fail in Hollywood, but terrified that he'd succeed. In a word, they were jealous. Jack Warner did have one condition. He would have to change his name from Jules Garfield to John. Jules was a nickname given to him at a young age, so from then on, Jules Garfield was known as John Garfield. It took a while to get going, but John landed a decent part in 1938's Four Daughters, a Michael Curtis film, where he played a doomed composer with rather a lot of romantic energy. The film hit theaters and the reviews poured in, glowing ones that earned him a nomination for Best Supporting Actor at the Oscars. Warner saw that they had uncovered a gem. They rewrote his contract and elevated him to star status, and put together the first Garfield vehicle called They Made Me a Criminal, this time with his name splashed above the title. In fact, they were also quickly rewriting their star's short history. Before Daughters took off, he'd shot a little B-movie called Blackwell's Island. Warners were not keen on their shiny new star to be seen slumming it in such a low-grade movie, so they threw an extra $100,000 at the project and called Michael Curtis back to direct some fresh scenes, turning it into A-movie material. It's actually quite an interesting movie, based on a real-life scandal that took place on New York's Welfare Island, now known as Roosevelt Island. The first press screening of the movie took place inside the Welfare Island prison. John's arrival on screen was electric. Audiences were unsure of what it was they were seeing in him, but it was hypnotizing, and entirely new. One of his most extraordinary qualities, which was spotted early by Jack Warner, was his intense sexual presence, and also the fact that he equally fascinated men and women. Men watched him on screen and imitated him, while women fantasized about being with him. This was gold dust in movie magnetism terms. However, the rosy early days with Warner's faded fast. Soon John was entrenched in disputes with the studio. They wanted him churning out crowd-friendly weepies like 1939's Dust Be My Destiny. He pushed back, holding out for scripts with authenticity, ones that let him stretch and show what he could do as an actor. These standoffs soon piled up and Warner's had heard it all before. Plenty of actors had idealistically campaigned to be given good roles. But good films don't make money, and that was the studio's primary objective. John would refuse a role, Warner's would freeze his paycheck, and round they went. In fact, he became one of the most suspended stars in studio history, with 11 separate suspensions being levied on him for refusing roles and other misdemeanors. It was a bind any actor in the 1930s studio machine could relate to. The contract gave Warners the whip hand. They could put him into whatever picture they pleased. But John had his own code. I believe the more successful an actor becomes, the more chances he should take. An actor never stops learning, he said. One film that bucked the usual trend and seemed to please both him and the studio was Daughters Courageous from 1939. It wasn't exactly a sequel to his breakout movie, though it reunited the same cast, just with a fresh story and new characters. Critics approved, but audiences didn't. They wanted a proper follow-up, which was tricky since Mickey Borden, John's character from the first film, had died. Michael Curtis said the movie was my obscure masterpiece. When World War II broke out, Garfield didn't hesitate to join up. He tried to sign up for the army, but he was rejected after they discovered his defective heart and the scarlet fever that had caused it. So he and Bette Davis started the Hollywood Canteen. However, before I get into the fascinating launch of this unique moment in history, where you could have your dishes washed by a movie star, I'd like to remind all of my viewers that we have another channel now, in case you haven't checked it out yet. It's called Rock and Roll Mysteries and is very much the same format as this one, only with our resident musical history nerd, Chester, taking on the narrating duties. We've already made videos on a variety of fascinating and mysterious stars, including Graham Parsons, Marianne Faithfull, Sandy Denny, and Phil Oakes, with others like Roy Orbison and Dusty Springfield in the pipeline. I'd be delighted if you'd check it out and subscribe if you enjoy it. I'd also like to remind you about our Patreon, which has weekly essays and other perks for patrons. Thank you so much to all who have already joined up. Now let's get back to John Garfield and the Hollywood Canteen. The Hollywood Canteen set up shop at 1451 North Cahuenga Boulevard, right in the heart of Hollywood. It ran from October 3, 1942 to November 22, 1945, as a place where enlisted men who mostly were headed off to World War II could grab a bite, hit the dance floor, or watch a show. While U.S. troops made up the bulk of the crowd, the joint also welcomed Allied forces and servicewomen from every branch too. All they needed to get in was their uniform, no cash required, since everything inside was on the house. Garfield and Davis were the main driving force behind it, and Davis worked so hard that she was forced to take a week in bed before the grand opening by her doctors, after suffering from severe exhaustion. A swarm of carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and other tradespeople teamed up with movie stars, using donated supplies to spruce up an old building. Actor Richard Wharf painted cowboy murals on the walls. Other stars pitched in with decoration and other work in what was a frenzy of activity. On Saturday, October 3, 1942, the canteen threw open its doors. A large number of soldiers, sailors, and other service members rolled in. Eddie Cantor was overseeing things that first night, while Davis gave a speech to salute the unions and guilds who contributed. The canteen ran Monday through Saturday from 7 p.m. to midnight, then switched to Sundays from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. Every hour and a half a show started, and another wave of waiting troops shuffled through the entrance. Over 3,000 stars and industry professionals signed up to help out. They did it all, greeting guests, waiting tables, clearing dishes, flipping burgers, washing pots, handing out cigarettes, pouring sodas, dancing with the troops, or scrubbing floors at closing time. Davis herself walked around as a cigarette girl. Laird Krieger's hands went pruny from too much time at the sink, which got him the nickname dishwasher hands. Betty Grable jitterbugged with cadets. Abbott and Costello went table to table telling jokes, and live music filled the air. Maria Riva, Marlena Dietrich's daughter, remembered a story about her mom getting into dish duty alongside Hedy Lamarr. Riva recalled Davis walking past and barking, "Get those two krauts out of the kitchen." It was very much a joke in Davis's typical abrasive tone. But Dietrich was intensely opposed to the NSDAP in her homeland, while Lamarr was an Austrian Jew, and therefore very much under threat from the Nazis. They were anything but the enemy. By late 1942, Vice President Garfield told the nation that about 5,000 servicemen packed the place on weekend nights, with 20,000 more streaming through each week. The morale boost was incalculable before these men were sent to face the horrors going on in Europe and the Pacific. Garfield went on the road too. He toured overseas to boost troop morale, sell war bonds, and starred in a run of flag-waving propaganda hit movies, like the particularly fantastic The Sea-Wolf, alongside Ida Lupino and Edward G. Robinson, or Air Force and Destination Tokyo, both from 1943. And there was also Pride of the Marines from 1945. That last one meant a lot to him. It told the story of Al Schmid, a heroic veteran who lost his sight during the horrendous action at Guadalcanal in 1942. He fought all night at the Battle of Tenaru, killing an estimated 200 Japanese soldiers after being blinded and multiply wounded by a grenade. Despite his awful injuries, he continued at his machine gun post, receiving instructions from his corporal about where to point his red-hot machine gun. To get it right, John stayed with Schmid and his wife in Philadelphia for weeks, and even blindfolded himself for hours to feel the part. Post-war, John kept the momentum going with several box office winners. He steamed up the screen with Lana Turner in The Postman Always Rings Twice in 1946, in what was one of the finest and most sexually provocative film noirs ever made. It's a real classic and, of course, gave birth to the famous line from John's character Frank, who retorts, "With my brains and your looks, we could go places." And by the way, not many of you tuned in to my double feature on Lana from last year. If you missed it, I'll link it on screen now. There's surely no star with a more dramatic and thrilling life than Lana, and there's plenty of details in the video that aren't covered in most accounts of her life, so check it out after this one. Next, he played opposite Joan Crawford in Humoresque, and joined the Oscar darling Gentleman's Agreement in 1947, which won Best Picture. In that one, he took a smaller role, as he was enthusiastic about the film's exposure of anti-Semitism in the US. Robert Blake once shared a story from the set of Humoresque, where he played a young John Garfield. During filming, there was one particular scene that Blake just couldn't get right. Frustrated, John took charge, clearing the set and stepping in to direct Blake personally. After they finally wrapped the scene, Garfield offered Blake a piece of advice that would stick with him forever. "Robert, remember this for the rest of your life. Your life is a rehearsal. Your performance is real." John's role in Body and Soul in the same year won him a Best Actor nomination at the Academy Awards, and it is possibly his finest film, certainly the best of several in which he played a boxer. That year, he also went back to Broadway for Skipper Next to God. Although he turned down a role which had been written for him, the lead in Elia Kazan's A Streetcar Named Desire. In fact, producer Irene Mayer-Selznick and Kazan had conceived the character of Stanley as an Italian-American played by Garfield, who was, of course, not Italian at all. Ironically, when Garfield declined the part, Selznick turned to a complete unknown named Marlon Brando. For about the only time in his career, Brando was considered not to look Italian enough. And so Stanley's ethnicity was switched to Polish-American to suit his lighter complexion. For the record, Brando has no more Italian ancestry than Garfield, being of German, Dutch, English, and Irish heritage. 1946 was the year his Warner deal ran out. Always ready for an argument, by this time even Garfield was worn out by the endless recriminations and bickering with Jack Warner. So he shocked the studio by deciding not to renew his contract. He walked out and set up his own independent studio instead. However, Warners were able to tempt him back for several more films over the next 5 years. The finest of which was perhaps 1950's The Breaking Point, a film noir adaptation of Ernest Hemingway's novel, To Have and Have Not. He also appeared in films for other studios, such as 1948's Force of Evil, directed by his Body and Soul screenwriter Abraham Polonsky. On June 19, 1951, his movie He Ran All the Way hit theaters. Nobody knew it then, but this would be his final film. The film came from a novel by Sam Ross, with Dalton Trumbo writing the script. The trouble was that Trumbo was about to begin a prison sentence for failing to name names in his HUAC investigation, which would have been a chilling foreshadowing for Garfield. So Guy Endore and Hugo Butler stepped in to complete his draft, and they altered it to match director John Barry's vision. Bob Roberts, who co-produced the picture through Garfield's own studio, was a noir maestro at that time. He too felt the heat of the Red Scare, and soon fled to England with his family. He Ran All the Way is a lean crime tale made all the better by a superb lineup. Shelley Winters, Wallace Ford, Selena Royal, Robert Hyatt, Gladys George, and Norman Lloyd all shine. John pours himself into Nick Robbie, the slow-witted crook he plays. Nick's a guy who trusts nobody, and it shows. Garfield's portrayal starts with a lousy hoodlum, but peels back the skin to show a man eaten up by a tough life. However, if John thought his own life had had a tough start, then the end of it was going to be a living nightmare. John's energetic patriotism during the Second World War was a reflection of his general political worldview, which could be described, at least up to that point, as a run-of-the-mill American liberalism. However, his views were also combined with ferocious anti-fascism due to his Jewish heritage. This meant that he was somewhat friendly to socialist and communist ideas at times, if not exactly a wholehearted supporter. After all, the Soviet Union were the US and Britain's principal allies during the war. Nevertheless, Garfield found himself tangled in the Red Panic that gripped the late 1940s and early 1950s. He threw his weight behind the Committee for the First Amendment, a group that pushed back against probes into Hollywood's supposed communist ties. He had also been active in donating to socialist causes and supporting workers' unions. This attracted the wrong kind of attention, to say the least. So in 1951, the House Committee on Un-American Activities summoned him to testify. John stood firm and gave a fiery defense of himself. He wouldn't out anyone as a Communist Party member or sympathizer, swearing he didn't know a single one in the movie industry. He said, "I have nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. My life is an open book. I am no red. I am no pink. I am no fellow traveler. I am a Democrat by politics, a liberal by inclination, and a loyal citizen of this country by every act of my life." But this coerced appearance before the committee had already obliterated his reputation. Red Channels, the Report of Communist Influence in Radio and Television, was an anti-communist pamphlet released as the HUAC investigations were ramping up. Published by the right-wing publication Counterattack on June 22, 1950, it listed 151 individuals from the entertainment industry, including actors, writers, musicians, and broadcast journalists, who were allegedly tied to communist influences. John Garfield was on the list. The document suggested that these individuals were part of a larger conspiracy to manipulate American media and bring communism to the American people. By naming them, Red Channels effectively blacklisted the entire group, and Hollywood studio chiefs shut John out of acting jobs for good. With the film world freezing him out, John headed back to Broadway. In 1952, he performed in a revival of Golden Boy, finally in the starring role that had slipped through his fingers years earlier. He felt truly in his element on stage, and much preferred the freedom he had there. He said in an interview, "Screen acting is my business, but I get my kicks from Broadway. I'm speaking of the license to present adult ideas and viewpoints, which we lack, and which means in turn that many of our pictures lack intelligent content." Under immense stress and being watched around the clock by government agents, he tried to scrub the stain of the accusations off his name. He started drafting an article for Look magazine, titled, "I was a sucker for a left hook," a reference to his many boxing movies, where he admitted he'd been duped by leftist ideas. The article was intended to denounce communism without ratting anyone out. His lawyer encouraged him to admit he'd been duped into giving time and money to communist-oriented organizations, unions, and charities. He explained his motivations by saying, "Actors are emotional. If somebody would come up to us and say, 'Sign here, everybody's doing it for civil liberties,' or 'Sign here to save the bread of children of writers banned from the studios because of their political beliefs,' I would sign because it was a right cause in which I believed." To try and improve his case, he actually set up a sit-down with the FBI. However, things turned sour quickly. The agent slid a file across the table. It contained stuff on his wife, Roberta, complete with her old Communist Party card and cash checks from party-backed events. They offered him a deal. If he would sign a statement denouncing her as a Red, they'd wipe his slate clean. Of course, Garfield didn't bite. He told them to go fuck themselves and stormed out. On May 9, 1952, Garfield left his New York apartment for good. He let his friends know this wasn't just a break from Roberta. The marriage was over. He told to Earl Wilson, the columnist, that a divorce had been agreed upon. His close friends later claimed that Roberta's pushback against the Look magazine article, denouncing communism, had been the last straw. She remained committed to the cause. Word reached him that the HUAC investigator was studying his testimony, hoping to nail him for perjury. His agent then passed along news that 20th Century Fox had him in mind for a film called Taxi, but the studio wouldn't offer a deal until the probe cleared him of any links to communism. He was also in line for the role of Terry in the upcoming film On the Waterfront, but as years earlier with A Streetcar Named Desire, this would go to Marlon Brando. 3 of his actor friends, Canada Lee, Matty Christians, and J. Edward Bromberg, had all died rather suddenly not long after the committee put their names on its list. He was now fearing for his life, and it was not only the threat of shady operatives watching him that were a threat. John had already ignored his doctor's stern warnings about the condition of his heart. On May 20th, he played tennis with a friend, and he mentioned that he'd been up all night. Later, he had dinner with actress and former showgirl Iris Whitney. Mid-evening, he started feeling ill, shivery as he put it. She brought him back to her home where he refused her offer to phone a doctor and went to bed instead. Morning came and she went into the room and found him dead. His already weakened heart, worn down over years of heavy smoking and likely stress by the blacklist fiasco, gave out at 39. His death came the very day that Clifford Odets testified under oath before HUAC that Garfield had never been a member of the Communist Party. Julie Garfield was just 6 years old, but she remembered the strain her father was under. Later, she explained, "It killed him. It really killed him. He was under unbelievable stress. Phones were being tapped. He was being followed by the FBI. He hadn't worked in 18 months. He was finally supposed to do Golden Boy on CBS with Kim Stanley. They did one scene, and then CBS canceled it. He died a day or 2 later." His funeral was spectacular, the biggest New York had seen since Rudolph Valentino's. Over 10,000 people jammed the streets outside the church, which was mobbed. The press frenzy around his death led to a legendary dark joke, John Garfield's still dead syndrome, which poked fun at the media's desperate coverage of the funeral that ran for weeks. John's estate, valued at more than $100,000, went to Roberta. Not long after, HUAC dropped its case on him, finally clearing his name. He was laid to rest at Westchester Hills Cemetery in Hastings-on-Hudson, in Westchester County, New York. So why has his name faded in the years since his death? Some biographers had given a pragmatic answer. The simple fact is that he never lived long enough to create an enduring legend like Humphrey Bogart. But then neither did Valentino, and Garfield was almost as popular in his days as the Latin Lover was in his. His daughter Julie has another view. "He was horribly neglected, forgotten, pushed aside," she said. "It was almost as if Hollywood was so ashamed of what was done to him that they almost made him disappear." But they weren't the only memories she had of her father. "He'd take me to the merry-go-round in Central Park or boating on the lake," she recalled. "He had a fantastic smile. He was so charismatic. People would always come up to him, and he loved it. He loved the attention. He was guileless. I always felt so special." All we can do now is ponder what kind of an actor the world missed out on. If the new young crowd like Montgomery Clift, Brando, and Dean had arrived on the scene with someone like John Garfield to look up to, the possibilities are extraordinary. But as it was, Garfield would not make it to middle age. His legacy and influence, however, have lived long after his death. Maybe jazz musician Wayne Shorter put it best. "You know the actor John Garfield? In one movie he walked up to this train station, the ticket booth, and the guy says, 'Yes, where are you going?' And he says, 'I want a ticket to nowhere.' I thought, that's it, the freedom to do that. I want a ticket to nowhere." That's all I've got for you this week. Why not head over to the Hollywood Mystery Store and check out our range of exclusive shirts? We've got everyone from Pola Negri to William Powell to Shelley Duvall on offer. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. Sweet dreams.